I'm Judge Andrew Napolitano, your host, here defending freedom, defending your natural rights, and defending your right to have a constitution that stays within the confines, to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. Before I introduce my first two guests, who are well known to many of you, I have to tell you, this is unbelievable. Fox News in a mosh pit. As Yogi Berra once said when he learned the mayor of Dublin was a Jew, only in America. My first guest is Sheriff Richard Mack, the former sheriff of Graham County, Arizona. And a local hero, if ever there was one, Maurice Thompson, director of the Buckeye Institute's 1851 Center for Constitutional Law. Gentlemen, welcome to Freedom Watch. Sheriff, when I asked the number 3 ranking member of Congress on the Democratic side, Congressman Jim Clyburn, where in the Constitution the federal government is authorized to micromanage health care, he looked at me as if I had two heads and said, Judge, most of what we do down here is not authorized by the Constitution.
No kidding.
I commend him for his candor, but what is the value of the oath to uphold the Constitution, which you took when you became a sheriff, I took when I became a judge, anyone here and watching us and listening to us took who's ever worked for the government? What is the value of that oath if it's not taken seriously?
Well, that's the whole solution, I think, to the entire problem of the constitutional degradation that we're experiencing across the country. I think that politician was just exemplifying the political correctness of the day. And both parties, the political correctness of both parties have replaced the Constitution with their own selfish agendas, and it's exactly what has brought oath keepers to the forefront of our country today. It has brought my effort to remind sheriffs across this country that when you take an oath, it's the only thing important. We can't replace that oath with going after potheads. That's not more important. There is nothing more important than a sheriff or judge or politician or a dog catcher. From the dog catcher all the way down to the president.
Maurice, are you surprised that the people who are trying to shove the federal micromanagement of health care down our throats boast about there's nothing in the Constitution over this, are in glee over the fact that they don't have to follow and uphold their oath?
Well, you know, Judge, it's interesting. We're operating under a dual system of constitutions currently. There's the initial Constitution that the founders passed, the written Constitution, and on the other hand, there's the redacted version that our congressmen use and that our judges have created over time through the progressives of the early 1900s and the New Dealers of the 1930s and 40s that shredded many of the prominent protections for individual liberty in that Constitution. What those politicians rely upon is this vague assertion of power under the Commerce Clause. And this is actually incredibly important for everybody to understand. What the Commerce Clause says is that Congress can regulate commerce amongst the several states. Commerce has been found to be economic activity. What they're saying with health care is that the very act of being alive is economic activity, because what they want to do is they want to mandate that you buy a government insurance policy approved of by the federal government merely because you exist. And they're saying that this is commerce. Well, if this is commerce, if the mere act of being alive is commerce, then the government is a government not of limited powers as the founders intended and as the Constitution states as written. Instead, it's a government of completely unlimited powers. It can do anything it wants to us. It could force us to join the health.
It's the reason we have a federal system, so that the states, we'll talk about this later tonight, can resist and reject and nullify the federal government. when it interferes. But we had a case in the Supreme Court last week, Sheriff, which is right up your alley, and it was sort of the opposite of the states nullifying the federal government. It's an effort to use the Supreme Court to remind the state of Illinois, and particularly the city of Chicago, that the right to keep and bear arms is a natural right that comes from our humanity. So how could the city of Chicago interfere with it?
They can't. Well, I actually...
And when you answer this, I want you to weave into your answer how the police feel about this. Do they feel any differently when they're in a city where they are the only ones that are armed and no one else is?
Well, the citizens should be scared to death of such a situation like that. The police can't be to your home. I spent 20 years in law enforcement. The police can't respond in time. I mean, the average response time is about 5 to 7 minutes. A lot of death can occur during that time, and citizens do have the right to keep and bear arms, the opinions of police notwithstanding. It really doesn't matter. The police have already sworn an oath, just as you and I did, to uphold and defend the Constitution. Let me remind all my brothers and sisters in law enforcement, the Second Amendment is still there, and the Founding Fathers intended it to be there. Now, you know, I sued the federal government when I was sheriff, and I won a case at the United States Supreme Court.
It's a great case.
It really is a great case, and really, I sued the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton was the one that defended that, so you might say that I was the only person in history to sue Bill Clinton on a non-sexual matter. But
and to win the case. The case, of course, is one in which the Congress attempted to commandeer the sheriffs all across the country and tell them what they had to do with respect to the right to keep and bear arms. And the Supreme Court said, no, the states still have some sovereignty and the Congress can't commandeer them. But Maurice, when the states themselves, the city of Chicago is nothing without the state of Illinois. There is something in the law in the state of Illinois that authorizes the city of Chicago to restrict the right to keep and bear arms. If that's a natural right, if it comes from our humanity, if it is merely the extension of our right to defend ourselves against anyone, even the government, when we have to defend ourselves, how could any government interfere with it?
Judge, the whole purpose for which our government was formed, both federal and state, is to protect our property rights. Our Constitution is Lockean, and it's based upon the philosophy of John Locke, who postulated back all the way in the 1600s in this idea of a social contract, where people form governments to mutually protect their property from the barbarians at the gates. Now the barbarians at the gates have become the governments themselves. And that's a very serious issue. And in fact, the whole idea of sovereignty, state sovereignty and dual sovereignty, is important because the idea is to limit the federal government so that states can then go above and beyond the federal government in affording greater protections of rights to individuals under their own state constitutions. And the Ohio Constitution does just that, and it does that for the right to bear arms.
President Reagan used to say that the beauty of our federal system is you can vote with your feet. Yeah. If you think taxes are too high in Massachusetts, you can move to New Hampshire. If you think regulation is too great in New Jersey, you can move to Pennsylvania. I'm picking real live examples, being a resident of the state of New Jersey. But when the federal government dictates more and more control over our lives, Sheriff, there is no opportunity to vote with your feet. The states become appendages of the federal government rather than laboratories for freedom. You have the last word in this segment. You'll both be back after our next guest.
Well, my favorite quote from Justice Scalia, who you know very well, is, quote, "But the Constitution protects us from our own best intentions." And I don't think you can get more powerful than that, but he goes on. He says this: "It divides power among sovereigns and among branches of government precisely so that we may resist the temptation to concentrate power in one location as an expedient solution to the crisis of the day." And that goes back to what he was saying about dual sovereignty. The states are sovereign. The case was all about dual sovereignty.
Maurice Thompson, Sheriff Mack, thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Great.